Hello, everyone. I am so excited about this live chat tonight, all about the power of self compassion. So, give us a few minutes to get ready, and then we'll get started. Hey! Hello! How's everybody doing tonight? If you could, please put an emoji to describe how your day's going. Hey!
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you totally fine.
Perfect. Perfect. Oh, wow. It's so good to see
It's
you.
so
How's your morning
nice to see
going?
you. It's good. We're just getting started over here. You and I are obviously 12 hours difference, which is
Yeah,
such a big difference.
I
But we're just
know.
getting started. I just fed my son some pancakes, and he's now settled. And here I
Aw.
am with you.
Oh, that's awesome. So, Nikki, if you could describe, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how your week's going so far, like 10 being fantastic and 1 being, like, the worst, like, what would you rate it and why?
I mean, I would probably rate the week being like a 7. The start of the week, we had a little bit of a health scare with my little
Oh,
one, but that was okay in the end.
yeah.
And then other than that, it's been a very productive week. So I'd say like a 7.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, mine
How
would be
about
like
you?
around yeah, mine would be like around a 6.5 to a 7.
Yeah?
Yeah, because
Yeah?
work is like hectic also and it's kind of tiring, but this conversation makes up for
Oh,
this hectic week. So, yeah.
nice.
Yep. So, Nikki, can you tell us like a little bit about yourself, like who you are and like maybe a fun fact about you?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm also a coach, and I've been a yoga teacher for nearly 10 years. I have like a private online practice where I work with people from all over the world, predominantly around areas of like low self-worth, low self-esteem, perfectionism, and trauma resolution. I used to work a lot within the space of addiction and addiction recovery and rehabilitation. That was like about 8 years ago when I first finished my studies. And I also work with other therapists and other coaches and space holders and yoga teachers, and I support them in building up their businesses and their practices and doing it in a way that feels really like aligned and in alignment with their values and their morals, which is always an interesting thing to do. Like, how do we balance that out?
Right.
So I do a lot of mentoring work as well. And an interesting fact about me, I mean, I guess it's interesting that I live in Bali in Indonesia. So that's
Wow.
interesting, I guess. I live on a little island. And I actually grew up here. So I moved here when I was about 1.5. And I grew up in Indonesia for most of my life.
Oh, wow. Wow, that is so
Yeah.
cool. And what do you love about living in Bali?
I mean, it's beautiful. It's like you're living on a tropical island, right? So it's always palm trees and blue skies and coconuts and all of those things.
Oh,
But I think more than that, my family is all still here. You know, my mom and my dad live 10 minutes down the road. My sister is a half an hour drive. My
oh,
brother's in
wow.
Singapore, so he's a little bit away, but still close. But you know, this is home, and I think that's more than anything else, more than the idealistic, you know, living on an island. It's actually just that my family is here, and this is where we feel safe and together, and you know,
Wow.
that's really nice for me.
Yeah, that's really good. Like, honestly, I could use the island vibe because I'm in the city. I'm in New York, so it's like concrete jungle, skyscrapers,
So
hustle and bustle.
different.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So it would be like between you living in New York and you living in Hawaii, I guess, would
Yeah.
be what I could compare it to.
Yep, that's perfect. That's a perfect comparison. Like any Bali, Hawaii, like any one of those,
Yeah.
I'm down with right now. But yeah, so today we're talking about the power of self-compassion. But before we dive into our conversation, I want to talk about your book, Good Enough. Like,
Okay,
I love that title. Like, can you tell me like what inspired you to write this book and like choosing that title? Like, what was the process like?
sure. Great question. This is the book here. That's what it looks like. And initially the title was going to be How to Be Good Enough, because it's the most common thing that I come across in my therapy work. So whenever I'm working with anyone about anything, when we kind of peel back the layers, it always comes down to this like core, this root cause or this root feeling that is very much rooted in the feeling of shame.
Mm,
Shame being the emotion, and the story attached to shame being, like I'm not good enough in some way, shape, or form. Like I'm wrong, I'm bad, I'm guilty, I'm broken, I'm flawed. There's this feeling that so many of us have, and yet all of us like work really hard to cover up, that we feel inherently, yeah, like faulty in some way, and not good enough, not pretty enough, not smart enough, not lovable enough, not worthy enough, whatever it might be. And it's just been, after working with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, it was just something that I was like, I really want to normalize this first and foremost. I want everyone to realize that it's normal to feel like this. And when we can normalize shame, what happens is that it's not as strong. Its grip on us is not as much, because shame is like a separation, right? It's like a feeling of I'm different to
mm,
you. And when we can
mm.
normalize it and we realize that everybody else actually has it, it doesn't have that power and that grip over us anymore. So
Right.
I really wanted to initially normalize it. And secondly, I wanted people to have a really practical way of navigating through it through the work of self-compassion, which in my opinion is the antidote to shame, is to learn how to become more compassionate towards ourselves and towards others so that shame cannot exist,
Right.
basically.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so good. Like, given like the idea of shame being like a separation from like your true identity, like how do you navigate like dealing with shame? Like, is that something that, well, I'm assuming that you've experienced those moments where you felt,
Yeah.
like you're not good enough. Like, how did you start to navigate that, and how did you implement those things with your work with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, for me, yeah, for sure. I mean, I had my own moments in my life where, I started going to therapy myself when I was about 18. And navigating, I think, understanding and unpacking and realizing, because at that time I didn't realize, and many people don't realize this, realizing that a lot of the time our shame stories, they're the stories that are embedded in us that form our sense of identity that were developed when we were children for the most part. And it's not because, a lot of people eye roll at the fact that, therapy always has to do with your childhood, but it's a reality that our identity is formed in childhood. You can't deny that. That's when we are learning how we fit into the world. Like, who am I? How do I belong? How do I remain safe? How do I remain attached? And so much of our sense of self that is then so embedded in our subconscious, that is developed when we are very, very young, and we don't actually have a fully developed brain, and we're very egocentric, and we don't have any understanding of the world. And so naturally our I am statements become very skewed, and they're made without enough information. And so, for the most part, a lot of that is formed then. And I didn't realize that when I was 18, And when I first went to therapy, I was like, wow, the reason I'm entering all these toxic relationships, for example, is because I still have these feelings of people pleasing and fawning, and I'm not worthy, and I need to have this type of thing from my father, And it wasn't until I unpacked that and learned how to meet that part of me, that childlike part of me, with more compassion, so that she could actually understand that that is not your narrative, that is
Mm,
not who you are, but it is something that that you identified with as a child in order to keep you safe. I had to develop people-pleasing tendencies when I was
right.
younger, because that's what kept me safe in my family dynamic. But as I'm an adult, I don't need that anymore because I'm not 5 anymore. But
Right.
people don't realize, that interlink. And so I think shame is something that we need to understand. It's created a lot of the time in childhood, but also it can happen in our teenage years, especially if we were bullied or anything like that in high school or in primary school, or also if we have trauma later on in our lives that kind of compounds on existing shame. So about 9 years ago, I went through really bad financial hardship with my previous business and, faced bankruptcy and was in a lawsuit with one of the large banks where I was living at the time. It was just a horrible, horrible time. And that financial trauma, like, compounded on my existing wound being I am guilty or I am wrong. And so that was really, really hard for me. And what happened as a result is I had a lot of shame around money that I then had to work on as an adult, especially in growing my business. And so once again, like, that's an adult trauma, but it's compounded on an earlier shame story.
Right.
And so these narratives, people, like I said, unless you're conscious of it or unless someone helps you to become conscious of it, you don't realize it's there. It's just the way you are. It's just the way you live your life. And from that place of I am bad, I am wrong, I'm not good enough, we then make our decisions and our actions, and our emotions come from that place and our thoughts come from that place. And, everything else comes, our reality is birthed from there. So learning how to meet that with more compassion, it simply means, how do I allow my shame to realize that it was there for a reason, it formed for a reason, I'm not bad or wrong for feeling that way, it all makes sense, and I can validate it and then actually see the real picture, what is actually going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow, that is so good. Like, especially when you talk about shame informing our like path to self-compassion. And I also resonate with you in the fact that therapy is very essential. And in fact, Guardian Chronicles in the comments, hey girl, she says therapy is so important and it's highly useful in figuring out the stressors of life, and that therapy will help us find a resolve. Like, I couldn't agree more with that, because even when I was going to therapy for the first time, like, at first I was like, it's going to help me get over, like, whatever I'm dealing with. But it really helped me to unpack, like, all of the traumas and the different, like, triggers that I had and
Yeah.
where that shame was actually coming from. And I think that's very important. And so I also wanted to ask, just like, expanding on that, like, when we look at shame and just like the effects that it can have on us, like, how would you go about, like, what would be the first steps to actually identifying that shame and like how to fix it? 'Cause.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite questions to ask, like, if you're feeling something, if you're feeling, let's say you find yourself saying, like, oh my God, like, why does this keep happening to me? I don't know, say you're in a situation that keeps happening and you're feeling really helpless and hopeless. Something to ask yourself, if you're trying to navigate it yourself, is ask yourself, what is the story I'm telling myself? Remembering that everything in your mind is a narrative. Like, you are you, and you are a person who has thoughts, but you're not your thoughts. And your thoughts are always going to be telling you different things and telling you stories, and not all the stories are true. So get curious with yourself. One of the core, I guess, qualities of compassion is the quality of curiosity. So always be curious with yourself. No, don't ever fall into the trap of believing that everything that you think is true. And whenever you're finding yourself in a situation that you're either feeling, your nervous system is activated, or you're feeling helpless or hopeless or confused or whatever it might be, just ask yourself, what's the story I'm telling myself right now? And if you start to, like, separate yourself from the story, you can start to write down the story. Like, what is the story? Oh, the story I'm telling myself is that I can't do this. Why? I can't do this because I'm not capable. Why? Right? Just get really curious with your own story, and you'll start to realize what your own I am statements are. I'm not capable. I'm not this. I'm not that. And you're like, okay, cool. I can see where this is coming from. And then you have the opportunity to validate it. You can say to yourself, I know this is scary, and I know we don't feel capable, but and you can start to look at the facts, and you can start to bring in a little bit of compassion and a little bit of wisdom and a little bit of hand holding, and navigate through what you're moving through in a way that is realizing that the part of you that feels ashamed is not who you are now. And if we're going to look at this from, like, I guess, a therapeutic perspective, you can also imagine that this is kind of like that inner child work where you're reparenting yourself. I would say that's the energy of self-compassion, where you're wanting to be, and it's not like an energy of a mom like coddling a little kid. You're not wrapping yourself in bubble wrap. It's like mama bear energy, right? You're like, I see you, I know this is hard, and I validate everything that's going on for you, and also I see your potential. And also, like, I'm going to be here with you. I'm going to hold your hand through this, and I'm going to show you that you can do this. So it's very empowering, without being dismissive. We really want to be able to validate the shame and understand where the shame has come from. So once you have your story, you can also ask yourself, when's the first time I ever felt this way? And what's my first memory of feeling this way? And you'll be able to track back, even if you're not with a therapist, you'll be able to track back, like, when is the first time that I felt scared of speaking in front of people? Oh, I know, when I was 7 and I had to do that thing at school and everybody laughed at me, right? And then what did that little girl need? Another question I often ask my clients if they do come back to an early childhood memory is I ask them, well, who did you speak to about that? Who was there for you at the time? Because we've got to remember that if a child is alone with their story, they make up whatever they want to make up, right? And that's often in a very egocentric way. If there's no one there, no adult there who's attuned, who understands and can help the child to understand, then we develop a shame story. And so if my client says to me, well, no one was there for me at the time, my next question might be, well, what would you have liked to have happened if you could have that time again? Or what would you say to that version of you if you were there now as an adult? And usually that answer is the compassionate piece that you need to tell yourself now as you navigate through this difficulty.
Wow. Yes. Honestly, like, the inner child work is some of the most difficult types of work that you can do, because you have to not only be introspective in this process, but also you have to go back to all those memories, all those things in the past. So, like, what would you say to somebody who wants to do the inner child work, but is just, like, struggling to actually start doing that?
I mean, inner child work is very delicate and it's very sensitive. My biggest piece of advice, if anyone wants to do inner child work, is to work with someone who's trauma informed. There are some people, even if their intentions are really good, sometimes inner child work can go too deep too fast, and that can re-traumatize a person. So we really want to make sure that when you are working with a therapist or even a coach, there are some fantastic coaches out there as well that are well trained and trauma informed, and they do inner child work, but you want to make sure that you trust the person that you're working with and that they are trauma informed and trauma aware, because basically your inner child needs to trust that person. So you got to think about it that way. Like, I'm bringing a child into this space. Do I trust this person to be with my child? So you don't want to be doing the work with anybody. It has to be with someone that, you meet with them first, you make sure you gauge like how you feel. Usually your first few sessions, it shouldn't go straight into the wound. It's very much about it's a slow dance as you learn how to develop the tools and techniques to meet that part of you with more and more compassion. I would say that my inner child work has been going on since I was 18, and it still happens now. I would be lying if I told you that it didn't. When I became a mother, there's a whole new layer of inner child work that comes up when you become a mom. And all your inner child wounds that are still there, they come up when you look at your own child, because you project a lot of them onto your child, not meaning to, So I also want people to understand that you're also not here to be fixed. I think the point of therapy and the point of this self-development work is to understand ourselves and to understand that being a human is really messy, and it's complex and it's complicated and it's ever evolving, and we are not things to be fixed. We're things to be understood. And when we can understand ourselves really well, then we feel a lot more safe and confident within our own being, within
Yeah.
our own lives.
Wow. Oh, yes. And I love what you said about we are not like people to be fixed. Like
No.
we're people to be understood. And I just like want to expand on that because a lot of the times, especially when we think about healing, it's always like, oh, we have to be 100%. Like we have to be like totally fixed, totally better. And I also struggled with this, especially when I first got my diagnosis of bipolar disorder. That
Yeah.
really like rocked my like view of myself and like my identity. And so just to speak to having a mental health condition and really understanding like the shame and the stigma behind that, like how do you help like a client, let's say there's a potential client trying to navigate like the shame and the stigma attached to their mental health condition, like how would you like walk them through like the process of being self-compassionate in that moment?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to understand, like, when we can above, zoom out of ourselves, right? Shame is very egocentric. It's very much it's like an I thing, very egoic, right? Now, we're all, like I said, human beings having a human experience, and all of our experiences are different, and our experiences shape who we are and the way we see the world. And a lot of our experiences and things that have happened to us, or even if it's genetic makeup that we were born with, whatever it might be, a lot of those things are outside of our control. And so when we start to control the uncontrollable, we feel in a lot of resistance with ourselves and with life, and we can often go into a depression as a result, right? Like, I don't want it to be like this. Why is it like this? Like all of this kind of denial and fighting with our reality. I think one of the most powerful things that we can do, which integrates, compassion, but also self-acceptance, is to be able to marry those things together, to be able to say, you know what, like, yes, this sucks. Yes, like validate, and also it's out of our control.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we accept where we are and learn how to work with it rather than against it? The more that we fight something and resist something, the harder it gets. So if it comes to, like, I have a client recently who was diagnosed with, she was recently put onto medication, and she was always been very, very anti-medication, and the medication was a very, very low dose, and it was done, after many years of trying many other types of things, and she had such a resistance to it, because her values didn't align with it. And a lot of the work we did was around not seeing it as, like, this is not the end of the road. This is one thing that is happening that we can experiment with. And if we can accept it and be open to it, then we're also open to the possibility of it being good. We're also open to the possibility of it being easier than we would have thought. We're open to the possibility of it not being that hard or not being that shameful. But if I'm in resistance to all of that, then I'm more unable to see it through that way, which means that the whole journey becomes so much harder. So really being able to accept what's within our control and what's outside of our control, accept the things that have influenced our lives and the things that are in our past that we cannot change, we cannot turn back the clock, and learn how to work with what we've got. And when we can do that, everything just becomes easier because the opportunities are there in front of us. It's not that I'm resisting my reality.
Right.
And I think that that's probably one of the most important things that we can do, is to learn how to lean into acceptance.
Yes. Yes, I definitely agree with that. And especially when you talk about resistance, because let me tell you, when I first got diagnosed, I really resisted like hard. Like I just didn't want to accept it. I didn't want to be on medication. But I love that you said once you get past that resistance, things do get a little bit easier once you start to understand. And I
Yeah.
will say that getting to learn more about like my mental health condition and how to treat it and what my triggers were. Like once you learn more about it, it does get easier to manage. I mean, there will be some days where, it's harder than others, but I do agree that once you get to that level of acceptance, you're able to not only like move forward with the experience, but you know how to handle the challenges a little bit
Yeah.
better.
absolutely. And even accepting that some days are going to be harder than others.
Yeah.
You know, just accepting that reality. Like it's not going to be like you said earlier. It's not like we have to be perfect all the time. We're not going to be fixed. Like I'm gonna have days that are really hard. I'm gonna have days that as a therapist I lose my shit, you know, like I'm
Yeah.
human. And I think that is like the ultimate takeaway of compassion is that we're humans having a human experience, and it's not always going to be rainbows and butterflies, and we have to accept that. And when we can accept that on those days where it's storm clouds and chaos, we're like, oh, okay, like I'm in it, but I know that it's not forever. I know
Right.
that everything changes. Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely. And just to go back to the comments again, Guardian Chronicles, she says, so proud of you, Sarah. Thank you. And she also says, Nikki, you are speaking gems. Yes, you are. Like, you're just like dropping so much knowledge. Like, and I'm so like grateful for that also.
Aww.
But I do also want to talk about more of like your work as a therapist, like a psychotherapist, and like how would you encourage somebody to start to seek help? Because I know therapy, even though it's more talked about, it's still taboo in a lot of
Yeah.
communities. So how would you encourage somebody to actually start to seek help?
I mean, it's so hard. I think you have to want to, you know, you have to want to be willing in some way. There has to be a willingness there. If you want to start really small, I would start by learning how to, or experimenting with, being more open and vulnerable with the people around you who love you and who you can trust. That would be like the very, very basic starting point. Is if you are feeling something, if you are experiencing something, and you're always keeping it to yourself or pushing it down, then my challenge to you would be to try to learn to be a little bit more vulnerable with the people around you who love you, and just see what happens as a result. Outside of that, I mean, I think with, you know, everything that happened during COVID and everything becoming more online, you know, there are so many more ways to work with people. Obviously, you can go through your general practitioner and go on a mental health plan if that is something that is open to you wherever you're living. So that's one option. Like I said earlier, though, it is really important that you find a therapist that you resonate with. It's like finding the right hairdresser or the right personal trainer or the right gynecologist. Like, you want to
Right.
trust them. And so you have to do a little bit of therapy shopping. And for many of us, you may not find the right person the first time, so don't give up. You want to continue to find the right person to ask for referrals. Look online, see who works online. Don't be afraid of working online, because it's, you know, it can be really, really, really amazing and not scary at all. So that's what I would say if you're wanting to look to work with someone. Outside of that, I mean, starting with, you know, understanding self-help concepts and reading some self-help books, that can also be helpful. My book has a lot of exercises in it, so a lot of the types of homework activities and journal questions and meditations and exercises that I do with my clients are in the book. So it is almost like you would be with me, and I navigate you through it and how to do those practices and self-reflections. I will say, though, that we get to a point where we can become like self-help junkies, where
Yeah.
it's all about learning and not about doing.
Right.
And that in itself is a form of resistance. So just to be aware within yourself, like where you are consuming a lot, and like maybe you're very knowledgeable, but you're not actually doing the action. So you're not actually changing, you're not actually taking that courageous step. And that would be when I would say, okay, let's put the books aside and let's actually work with someone so that you can start to experiment with your own life in taking these concepts and putting them into action, because that is where the change happens. That's where you see a difference. And a lot of people who are very knowledgeable about mental health concepts and all of these things, they're the ones who feel the most frustrated when their lives are not, you know, are not kind of going the way that they know that they could, and yet they're
Right.
not willing to make the change. So if that is anyone listening, I would say, you know, your next step is to not do and pick up another book, but your next step is to work with someone in person.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And especially about what you said about you have to do some therapy shopping, because I think
Yeah,
there's a common misconception that, oh, once I find a therapist, like that's it, that's the end all be all. And I
yeah,
thought that too when I first started, but you really have to work with somebody that you trust, and I think that trust factor is really essential. And I also love what you said about putting things into action, because a lot of the times it's like, we could get the knowledge, but if we're not putting all of the things that we learn and all of the exercises into practice, like it's not going to really make an effect. And so you're going to all these sessions, and like you said, you're wondering why your life is still the same, even though you're
yeah,
getting all this knowledge.
yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's a big part that people are afraid of. They're afraid of taking action because action means change, and change is scary, and humans don't like
Yeah.
change because they don't know what's on the other side. So that's that resistance piece again. There's a lot of resistance to change, and so we have to be able to navigate through that and to take those really small steps to creating, we're all capable of creating a new reality for ourselves, even if that's just through the way that we see the world, which is the most powerful thing that is within our control.
Right, right. No, I definitely agree. And you mentioned that the practices in your book. Do you mind sharing like maybe a couple so we can get a feel of what they
Yeah,
are?
sure. Probably one of my favorite practices that's probably the easiest for us to do or you to do, anyone watching this, would be it's something called the critic versus your compassionate self, and it's a journaling exercise. So I would say maybe start there. And what it looks like is you want to get your journal, and you just want to split the page in half. So you do a line down the center like this. And
Mm-hmm.
on this side, you would write my inner critic. And on this side, you would write my compassionate self or my higher self or my wiser self, however you want to relate to that part of you. And at the end of the day, when you're sitting down in reflection, if you have some time before bed, go through your day in your mind and just think about all the things that your inner critic said. So work from morning until nighttime and just think about, it could be that you woke up in the morning, you looked in the mirror and you said to yourself, God, I look disgusting, and then you keep going on with your day and you get stuck in traffic and you notice you remember your inner critic saying, what's wrong with me? I'm always letting people down. Right? And then maybe there's another thing that happens and your inner critic says something along the lines of, why can't I just, why does this always happen to me? I'm so useless, right? So you'll have like a whole series of things throughout your day that your inner critic says. And then on the right-hand side, so usually what I say to my clients is write all of that down and remember that it's just a part of you. It's not all of who you are, it's a part of you. And then close your eyes and think about someone that you really love, someone that means the world to you, someone who you want only the best for, and picture them in your mind. And when you come back to your piece of paper, imagine that that person has said those things to you. And on the right-hand side, channel your inner compassionate self, your wiser self, and respond to each one from the lens of compassion, using validation. So you might say, I know you woke up this morning and felt really shit in your body. And then you might bring in that kind of understanding. You are on day one of your cycle. We always are kind of
Right.
like bringing in that feeling of like, I know that this has happened before. And then you could say something along the lines of, I think it's important here to remember all the things that our body does for us rather than just the way our body looks. I think you're
Right.
beautiful, whatever it might be. Or the next one might be, I know that I know you feel like you're letting people down when you were stuck in traffic today. There's nothing you can do about getting stuck in traffic. It's completely outside of our control. When you got to the office, no one seemed upset. So it's not true,
Right.
right? So you're just really helping yourself to I guess like work the muscle, if you will, and to activate that voice. Because for most people, your inner compassionate voice doesn't exist. And if it does exist, it only exists with other people, not with yourself. So
That's true.
it's really an exercise of getting to work it for yourself. And the more you can do this, I've had clients of mine who have done this journaling practice like every day for 3 months. And the more you do it, the more active that other part of you becomes, and it starts to respond to your critic in real time, which is really, really, really helpful. So that's one practice that you could do. But the book has so many. It has so many.
Yeah, wow, I really love that one. Like, cause it's just you're putting in perspective, and I love how you said like think of somebody that you really love and care about, because we wouldn't say the things that we say to ourselves, we would
We would
never say.
never say to somebody else.
Right, we would never say that to someone else.
We would
And
never say the things to other people. Oh my God, how rude, right?
right. No, that's true. But it's just like, I love what you said about self compassion. Like, even though it is self compassion, it's most exercised when you do think about, okay, how would I say this to like my mom or my sister, if they're saying those things to me. And I also love that you're going throughout the day and like
Yeah.
really reflecting about like what you say to yourself, because it is important to think about, okay, what am I speaking over myself on a daily basis? Like, what kinds of things am I like putting out into my atmosphere?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important
Yeah.
to actually navigate in order to be more self-compassionate too.
Absolutely. And it's really like for a lot of people it's very eye-opening. Like they don't even realize that they are spending their day saying these types of things to themselves. And it's not until they write them down that they go like, wow, this is my inner dialogue. Like this is how I speak to myself. Like no wonder my self-esteem is so low. Or like no wonder I'm not willing to take risks. No wonder I don't have confidence to speak up with my friends. Like if I was to speak to anyone in that way, they wouldn't either.
Yeah.
So it's really about like understanding. And I think, when we do get to that realization, once again, it's important to not like hate on our inner critic, because our inner critic also serves the purpose of protection.
Yeah.
She's just like, I always imagine her as like a mean older sister who like really loves you, but who's really bitchy. And like her purpose is to love you and protect you. But sometimes the way that she says things is not nice.
Yeah.
So I think we also can't hate on her. It's just that she really is trying to actually protect your inner child by making sure that you stay in the box that she thinks you have to be in, so that that inner child doesn't get hurt. So it's once again this whole reparenting thing is we have to ask the bigger sister to step aside because she's not actually quite ready to be a parent, and we need to step in as the mother and kind of regulate the situation.
Oh wow, I've never seen an inner critic like that in my life. I've always seen her as like, the authoritarian, like terrible person, but just framing it in that dynamic, especially when you talk about reparenting and just being like, hey, older sister, you need to step back a little bit. It's okay. Like, like I've never really saw that before. Like that's pretty cool.
I'm glad that's a new perspective for you. I mean, the inner critic's role, she's a fierce protector. She is she loves you so much, and that's what I always want my clients to know is like I know that she's really mean, but her core purpose is the purpose of protection. That is her core purpose. And so we have to also honor her for that and say like, I know you're trying to keep me safe, but actually I'm a big girl now.
Yes. Wow. Oh, well, now I see my inner critic totally differently. Like, thank you for that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah. So I also want to talk more about like just being practical about like reparenting, because I know that we spoke about that a lot, but many people might not know what reparenting actually is. So can you talk a little bit about what reparenting is and how it's like actually beneficial to self-compassion?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said earlier, and it is a hard kind of concept to grasp when we're first understanding it. But I mean, basically, all of us as people, we're all made up of different parts, or sub-personalities, if you will. And different schools of thought and different theory have named these sub-personalities different things. But the best way to understand it is like, when you're thinking about reparenting in particular, there is the part of you, there is the sub-personality within you that is kind of frozen in time as a child. So that part of you still thinks and feels and acts even sometimes like a child, like a 5 or 6 year old child, because what happened in those years of your life are so embedded, not only in your thoughts and in your sense of self, but in your muscle memory, in your emotions, in your nervous system. And depending on what a person has experienced in their life, their inner child will be either more or less prominent, more or less active, right? Now, like I said earlier, when someone experiences something in childhood and maybe they didn't receive the attunement that they needed at that time. So maybe there was no one to talk to at the time. Maybe there was, maybe there was love. And I don't want anyone to ever think that when we talk about the way that we relate to our caregivers, a lot of people say to me, yeah, but my parents were amazing. Yes, so are mine. My parents are amazing. I love my parents. I love them. And also sometimes when we were younger, our needs were not met by our parents, not because they didn't love us, but because they weren't attuned to what we wanted, or because they didn't understand us. And so it's not that they were trying to be malicious or they were trying to hurt us. There was a lack of understanding that meant that the child did not receive the attunement that they needed at that moment. So there creates a belief at that time. There may create a nervous system experience. There is behaviors and what have you that are linked to that period of our time. And then reparenting is basically the process of showing up for that part of you in the way that you needed at the time. So, let's say, I'll give an example. A client of mine, he had, came from a wealthy family, roof over his head, went to a great school, had all of the things, tick, 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 tick. He is a highly sensitive person. He was a highly sensitive child. And he also, even now as an adult, physical affection is his love language, right? His parents, from the way that they were raised, there was not a lot of emotional communication within the household, and there was no physical affection at all. So there was like the talking, the saying, I love you, etc., but there was never the hugs. There was never the cuddles in bed. There was never like just those moments of being with him, which is what he really needed. And also there was very much a lack of understanding of his emotions, which meant he had to bottle a lot of things inside. So all of this is still present in his life as an adult. And so his process of reparenting requires him to understand that that little boy in him was missing these things. And how do we seek out these things now in our current day situation? So how does he learn how to validate his sensitivity now as a man? How does he learn to regulate his emotions as a man? And also within his marriage, we've worked together with him and his partner on introducing more physical affection and him seeking physical affection from his partner, not in the way of intimacy like sex, but in the way of just every day coming home and having a hug, like just having that thing that he needs, that little boy in him really missed and longed for in his own childhood. So we look at different ways to fulfill and to help that little boy in him feel seen, heard, and understood. And that will look different for everybody, but it's really about asking ourselves, what did I need at the time that I did not have? And how do I give that to myself now?
Yes, I think that's really important. And I think that's also the greatest act of self-compassion is to just give ourselves what we were missing as children.
Yeah.
And at that time, even as a child, it's like you don't even realize that you're missing these things until you're an adult and you realize that, oh, maybe this is like a core memory or a core event that happened or something that I
Yeah.
didn't get.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of people just, I was talking to someone yesterday about this. I think a lot of people they forget that we're actually just big kids. Like, we are adults, yes, and we do adult things and have adult jobs. But really, we are also adult children. We're still children, and we do still carry those feelings and those beliefs. And, I know that for me, sometimes I'm like, sometimes I still feel like a child sometimes in certain situations. I'm like, am I actually an adult with a child? Like, I don't feel like that. I think we do have, we have to remember that we are still adult children and that those feelings and those beliefs, like, they're always going to be with us. And so it's just like, how do we learn how to navigate them and to not let the childlike part of ourselves take over our adult lives, whereby we then become like helpless and dependent like children when we are actually adults and empowered and have choice and all of these things.
Right. Yeah, that's like also very important. And I just love how, to give a little recap of our conversation, I love how we discovered shame and its role in making us aware that we need to be more compassionate with ourselves. I love that exercise that you did about the inner critic on one side and your, self-compassionate like version of yourself on the other, and really listing out the way that you talk with yourself. And you just like blew my mind with the view of the inner critic. I'm gonna start seeing her as a big sister who's just kind of me sometimes. But we discovered that, and then also like the role of reparenting and why that inner child work is so important. And so, Nikki, I want to thank you so much for just
Thank
dropping
you.
so many gems and knowledge. And before we go, I have one final question for you. What
Yeah.
advice or words of encouragement do you have for somebody who's struggling to give themselves self-compassion?
I mean, I would say that you're not alone, first and foremost. That you're not alone, that a lot of people are in this space of struggle. Um, And I would probably say, to think about what you would say to someone who is in a similar position, just to help them to kind of shift out of that mindset, and to be able to see what it might be that they could need in this moment, when they try to shift their perspective. So, if someone else was really struggling and in the same position, what would you say to them? And I would also say not to force yourself to do anything too crazy, too hectic. Don't think you have to create like a 60-point morning routine in order to get yourself, out of that situation. One day at a time, one step at a time, moving in alignment to your needs. But just one little thing, one day at a time, can be really, really helpful.
Yes, I definitely agree. Well, thank you so much, Nikki, for
Thank
joining
you.
me tonight. It was so great.
So nice to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, of course. And everyone, stay tuned for more empowering episodes on Rough Edges.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.